Good evening, friends, and welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we're going to drift into the fascinating and surprisingly strange world of medieval food, where nothing was quite as it seemed and every meal held secrets that would astonish us today. I'm so glad you've chosen to spend this quiet evening with me, exploring the gentle mysteries of centuries past. Before we begin our journey together, take a moment to dim your lights and settle comfortably under your softest blanket. Feel the weight of the day lifting from your shoulders as you sink deeper into your pillow. Let the gentle hum of the outside world fade away, replaced by the warm crackle of an imaginary medieval hearth. If this calm journey through history's kitchen helps you unwind and drift peacefully into sleep, feel free to tap that like button and subscribe to our channel, but only if it feels right for you at this moment tonight. I want to share with you 5 remarkable facts about medieval food that will surprise you. Facts so unexpected they might seem like fiction if we didn't have the historical records to prove their truth. We'll wander through castle kitchens, where the wealthy dined on dishes that would make modern food critics weep with confusion, and into humble cottages where peasants created culinary magic from the simplest ingredients. We'll discover how medieval people turned eating into an art form that was equal parts necessity, creativity, and pure theatrical spectacle. Imagine, if you will, stepping through a doorway that exists somewhere between dream and memory, into a world where sugar was more precious than gold, where bread could serve as both dinner plate and legal document, and where the wealthy competed to serve the most outrageously elaborate dishes at their feasts. Close your eyes and let your mind wander back through the centuries, past the Industrial Revolution, past the Renaissance, into that mysterious time we call the Middle Ages, when the very act of eating was filled with wonder, superstition, and surprises that would leave us speechless today. Let me tell you about one of the most ingenious inventions in the history of dining, something so clever and practical that it makes our modern disposable plates look wasteful and boring by comparison. Picture yourself sitting at a medieval feast, surrounded by the soft glow of flickering candles and the gentle murmur of conversation. The great hall stretches around you, its stone walls draped with colorful tapestries that dance gently in the warm air rising from the massive fireplace. You can hear the soft crackle of burning logs, the quiet rustle of silk and wool as your fellow diners shift in their seats, and the distant clatter of serving dishes being prepared in the kitchen below. But here's where things get interesting, where medieval ingenuity reveals itself in the most delightful way. You're not sitting in front of a ceramic plate or a wooden trencher, as you might expect. Instead, before you lie what appears to be a thick, flat piece of bread, about the size of a dinner plate, maybe a little larger. This isn't just any bread, mind you. This is a trencher, and it's about to change everything you thought you knew about medieval dining. The trencher was typically made from a day-old loaf of bread, sliced horizontally to create a flat, stable surface. The bakers who made these weren't just feeding people. They were creating the medieval equivalent of our modern dinner plate, but with a twist that would make today's environmental advocates weep with joy. You see, this bread plate wasn't just a surface to hold your food. It was part of the meal itself, designed to absorb the delicious juices and flavors of whatever was placed upon it. Imagine the scene as servants begin to bring out the evening's feast. The first course arrives, perhaps a succulent roast with rich, savory gravy that pools and seeps into the bread beneath it. The trencher acts like the world's most delicious sponge, soaking up every drop of flavor, every hint of spice and seasoning. As the meal progresses, this humble piece of bread transforms into something extraordinary. A flavor-laden foundation that carries the essence of the entire feast within its crust. Now, here's where medieval society reveals its fascinating complexity, its intricate web of social customs and charitable practices. When the wealthy diners had finished their meal, when they had eaten their fill of the roasted meats and exotic delicacies, they didn't simply discard these bread plates. Oh no, that would have been wasteful beyond measure in a world where every scrap of food held value. Instead, these trenchers, now saturated with the flavors of the feast, were collected and distributed to the poor waiting outside the castle or manor house. Can you imagine the anticipation of those less fortunate souls, gathered in the cool evening air beyond the great hall's walls? They knew that patience would reward them with these incredible flavor-soaked pieces of bread, each one a complete meal in itself, carrying the taste of dishes they could never afford to buy. It was like receiving a gourmet sandwich that had been lovingly prepared by the feast itself. Each trencher unique in its combination of absorbed flavors and textures. This practice wasn't just charitable. It was practical in ways that speak to the medieval mind's incredible efficiency. In a world without modern waste disposal systems, where every resource had to be carefully managed and conserved, the trencher system eliminated food waste almost entirely. The wealthy got their elegant dining experience. The poor received substantial, flavorful meals, and nothing edible was thrown away. It was sustainability before the word existed, recycling elevated to an art form. But the trencher tradition goes even deeper than mere practicality. It reveals something beautiful about medieval society's understanding of community and responsibility. The act of sharing these bread plates created a direct connection between the rich and poor, a tangible link that went beyond simple charity. The wealthy weren't just giving away scraps. They were sharing the very foundation of their meal, offering a piece of their dining experience to those who had less. The preparation of trenchers was itself an art form, requiring bakers to understand exactly how different types of bread would interact with various foods. Some trenchers were made from dense, dark bread that could withstand the weight and moisture of heavy stews and roasts. Others were crafted from lighter, more absorbent loaves, perfect for soaking up the delicate sauces of fish dishes or the sweet syrups of desserts. The best bakers became famous for their trenchers, their reputation built not just on taste, but on functionality and durability. Picture the kitchen staff carefully selecting each trencher for its intended purpose, matching the bread to the dish with the precision of a modern sommelier pairing wine with food. The thick, hearty trenchers would be reserved for the robust meat courses, while the more delicate ones would await the arrival of subtly seasoned fowl or the elaborate sugar sculptures that served as both decoration and dessert. At the grandest feasts, as the evening progressed, and course after course was served upon these edible plates, something magical happened. The trenchers became a living record of the meal, each one telling a unique story through the patterns of stains and absorbed flavors. A trencher that had held roasted peacock would carry different marks than one that had supported a delicate fish course, and the servants who collected them could read these edible histories like pages in a cookbook. The social implications of trenchers extended beyond the immediate act of dining. They represented a world where waste was unthinkable, where creativity and necessity combined to create solutions that were both elegant and efficient. In our modern world of disposable everything, there's something deeply satisfying about imagining a time when your dinner plate was not only edible, but became more delicious as the meal progressed. As you drift deeper into this medieval evening, imagine the satisfaction of that final moment when, with the formal dining concluded, you're invited to eat your own plate. Picture tearing off a piece of that flavor-soaked bread, tasting the concentrated essence of the entire meal in a single bite. It would be like eating a culinary symphony, each absorbed flavor contributing its own note to a complex and satisfying conclusion to the evening's feast. And as we leave that warm medieval hall, with its glowing fires and satisfied diners, let your mind carry with it the gentle wisdom of the trencher, a reminder that sometimes the most innovative solutions come from the marriage of necessity and creativity, from a world where nothing good was ever wasted, and where even the plates themselves were designed to nourish and delight. Now, let your mind wander to something that might seem impossible to believe, something so extraordinary that it reveals just how different the medieval world was from our own sugar-saturated modern lives. Picture yourself walking through a medieval marketplace, the morning mist still clinging to the cobblestones, vendors calling out their wares in voices that echo off the narrow walls of timber and stone buildings. The air is filled with a symphony of scents, the earthy aroma of fresh bread, the sharp tints of cheese, the green freshness of herbs and vegetables. But there's one scent that's notably absent, one sweetness that we take for granted today, but was rarer than the most precious gems in medieval times: sugar. That white crystalline substance we sprinkle carelessly into our coffee and bake into countless treats without a second thought, was once so valuable that it was literally worth more than its weight in gold. Let me paint you a picture of just how precious this sweet treasure was in medieval society, how it shaped not only cuisine but politics, trade routes, and the very structure of wealth itself. In the year 1319, if you had walked into the court of King Edward II of England with a pound of refined sugar, you would have been carrying something worth approximately the same as 15 pounds of silver. To put this in perspective, that same amount of money could have bought you a decent horse, a year's worth of wages for a skilled craftsman, or enough grain to feed a family for several months. Sugar wasn't just expensive. It was a luxury so extreme that only the wealthiest nobles and royalty could afford to use it regularly. Imagine the reverence with which a medieval cook would handle a small portion of sugar, measuring it out grain by precious grain, treating each crystal like a tiny diamond. The sugar would be kept locked away in special containers, sometimes in the same strong boxes where gold and jewels were stored. Because, in many ways, that's exactly what it was. The key to the sugar box was as closely guarded as the key to the treasury, and household accounts from great castles show that sugar purchases were recorded with the same meticulous care as payments for fine silks or rare spices. But where did this miraculous substance come from? And why was it so incredibly difficult to obtain? The story of medieval sugar is really a story of incredible journeys, of merchants brave enough to travel thousands of miles through dangerous territories, facing bandits, storms, and political upheaval, all for the chance to bring back a few precious pounds of sweetness. Most of Europe's sugar in the early medieval period came from the far reaches of the known world, from sugarcane plantations in places like Cyprus, Sicily, and the Levant. The process of refining sugarcane into the white crystals that medieval nobles prized was itself a complex and expensive undertaking, requiring specialized knowledge, specific equipment, and enormous amounts of fuel to maintain the high temperatures necessary for proper crystallization. Picture the sugar refineries of medieval Cyprus, where skilled workers labored over massive vats of boiling cane juice, carefully monitoring temperatures and timing that could make the difference between success and a ruined batch. The air would have been thick with sweet steam, the ground sticky with spilled syrup, and the workers would have moved with the precision of alchemists, because in many ways, that's exactly what they were. They were transforming a simple plant into what amounted to edible gold. The journey from these distant refineries to the tables of European nobility was fraught with dangers and expenses that multiplied the cost at every step. Sugar had to be transported by ship across the Mediterranean, a voyage that could take weeks or months and was subject to the whims of weather, pirates, and political conflicts. Each pound of sugar that made it safely to port represented not just the labor of growing and refining, but the risks and costs of one of the most dangerous trade routes in the medieval world. Once the sugar reached European ports, the expenses didn't end. Merchants had to pay customs duties, transportation costs for overland routes, and the fees of countless middlemen who each took their share of the profit. By the time a pound of sugar reached the castle kitchen of a wealthy lord, it had changed hands dozens of times, and its price had increased exponentially with each transaction. The scarcity of sugar led to some fascinating culinary creativity among medieval cooks. They learned to extract sweetness from sources that might surprise us today, becoming masters at concentrating the natural sugars found in fruits, honey, and even certain vegetables. Honey was the primary sweetener for most people, but even honey was precious enough that it was used sparingly, saved for special occasions and important guests. But when sugar was available, oh, the things medieval cooks could do with it. They didn't just sprinkle it on food as we might today. Instead, they transformed it into elaborate sculptures and decorative pieces that served as both art and dessert. Picture the most important feast of the year in a great castle, the tables groaning under the weight of elaborate dishes, and at the center of it all, a magnificent castle made entirely of sugar, complete with tiny sugar knights and sugar flags flying from delicate spun sugar towers. These sugar sculptures weren't just impressive to look at, they were statements of wealth and power. A lord who could afford to commission a life-size sugar swan or an intricate sugar garden was demonstrating to his guests that his resources were so vast he could literally afford to eat art. The skill required to create these masterpieces was extraordinary, with specialized sugar artists commanding fees that rivaled those of painters and sculptors working in more permanent materials. the medicinal properties attributed to sugar in medieval times add another layer to its mystique and value. Medieval physicians believed that sugar had healing properties, that it could balance the body's humors and cure everything from melancholy to digestive disorders. Sugar was prescribed as medicine, dispensed in tiny doses from the apothecary's shop alongside other rare and precious remedies. The wealthy would consume small amounts of sugar not just for pleasure, but in the belief that it was promoting their health and longevity. As you settled deeper into your comfortable position, imagine the anticipation that would have filled a medieval kitchen when word came that a shipment of sugar had arrived safely at the local market. The head cook would have hurried to inspect the precious cargo, examining each crystal for purity and quality, negotiating carefully for the best price, while knowing that whatever they paid would strain the household budget. The sugar would be brought back to the castle with the same ceremony reserved for other treasures, locked away safely until the next grand occasion worthy of its use. The gradual increase in sugar availability during the later medieval period marked a significant shift in European cuisine and culture. As trade routes became more established and sugar production expanded, this once impossible luxury slowly became more accessible to the merchant classes and wealthy townspeople. But even as sugar became slightly more common, it retained its association with wealth, power, and sophistication. And as we drift away from this world where sweetness was measured in gold, where every grain of sugar represented adventure and risk, let your mind hold on to the image of those medieval cooks, carefully portioning out their precious crystals, creating moments of pure sweetness that were all the more precious for their rarity. In a world where sugar truly was the sweetest treasure of all, let me share with you one of the most fascinating and unexpected truths about medieval life, something that reveals just how deeply food was woven into the very fabric of society, law, and justice. Picture yourself in a bustling medieval town on market day, the narrow streets filled with the cheerful chaos of commerce. Merchants hawk their wares from wooden stalls. Children dart between the legs of horses and donkeys, and the air rings with the calls of vendors and the general hum of a community going about its daily business. But beneath this seemingly simple scene lies a complex web of regulations, laws, and social control that would astonish us today. At the heart of this system was something so basic, so fundamental to daily life, that we might never think of it as controversial or politically charged. I'm talking about bread, that simple combination of flour, water, and yeast that formed the cornerstone of every medieval diet. But in the Middle Ages, bread was never just bread. It was a weapon of social control, a tool of government regulation, and the center of one of the most elaborate systems of quality control and consumer protection that the world had ever seen. The story begins with what was known as the Assize of Bread, a set of laws first established in England around 1266 but echoed in various forms throughout medieval Europe. This wasn't just a simple set of guidelines about how bread should be made. It was a comprehensive legal framework that controlled every aspect of bread production, from the quality of flour that could be used to the exact weight and price that loaves could be sold for. Breaking these laws wasn't just a minor offense. It could result in fines, imprisonment, or even being banned from the baking trade entirely. Imagine the medieval baker rising before dawn to begin the day's work, but knowing that every loaf they produced would be subject to scrutiny that would make modern food inspectors seem lenient by comparison. The law specified not just how much a loaf should weigh, but exactly what ingredients could be used, how the bread should be marked to identify its maker, and even what time of day it could be sold. The price of bread was tied directly to the price of grain, with complex mathematical formulas that determined exactly how much profit a baker was allowed to make. But here's where the story takes a turn that reveals the ingenious and sometimes devious nature of human creativity. Faced with these rigid regulations, medieval bakers developed an entire arsenal of tricks and techniques to maximize their profits while technically staying within the law. They became masters of what we might call creative compliance, finding loopholes and workarounds that would have made modern lawyers proud. One of the most common techniques was known as the hollow loaf trick. Picture a baker carefully crafting what appears to be a perfectly normal loaf of bread, properly sized and weighted according to the law. But if you were to cut into this innocent-looking loaf, you might discover a hollow space in the center, a cavity that reduced the actual amount of bread while maintaining the required external dimensions. The baker would carefully seal this hollow space so that it was invisible from the outside, and the loaf would pass inspection until some unfortunate customer discovered they'd been sold more air than bread. Another favorite trick involved what was known as the false bottom technique. Bakers would create special baskets or containers with false bottoms that made their loaves appear to be sitting higher and therefore larger than they actually were. When an inspector came to check the size and weight of the bread, they would see what looked like properly sized loaves, but the clever construction of the display container created an optical illusion that hid the true dimensions of the product. The authorities, of course, weren't naive about these attempts at deception. They developed their own sophisticated methods of detection and punishment that would have impressed any modern fraud investigator. Special officials, known as ale conners and bread weighers, were appointed to patrol the markets, armed with official weights and measures, conducting surprise inspections that could make or break a baker's reputation and livelihood. Picture the scene when one of these officials arrived at a baker's stall, the sudden hush that would fall over the market as word spread that an inspection was taking place. The baker would try to maintain an air of confident innocence, while the official carefully examined loaf after loaf, weighing them on certified scales, checking for proper markings, and testing the quality of the flour and other ingredients. The tension in the air would be palpable because everyone knew that a failed inspection could result in immediate and severe consequences. The punishments for bread fraud were both creative and public, designed not just to penalize the offender, but to serve as a warning to others who might be tempted to try similar tricks. One of the most common punishments was the pillory, where the offending baker would be locked in a wooden frame in the town square, exposed to public ridicule and whatever rotted vegetables or other unpleasant projectiles the townspeople felt like throwing. But even more humiliating was the practice of hanging the substandard loaves around the baker's neck while they stood in the pillory, creating a very public display of exactly what crime they had committed. Some towns developed even more elaborate punishment rituals. In certain places, Bakers who were caught selling underweight bread were forced to be dragged through the streets on a hurdle, a wooden frame usually reserved for transporting criminals to execution. The message was clear. Cheating customers out of their daily bread was considered a crime almost as serious as theft or assault. But the most ingenious aspect of the medieval bread regulation system was how it created a network of community oversight that went far beyond official inspectors. Every customer became a potential quality controller. Every housewife a trained detective capable of spotting the signs of inferior bread. Women, in particular, developed an expertise in evaluating bread that was passed down through generations, teaching their daughters to recognize the weight, texture, color, and even sound that indicated properly made bread. Community vigilance created a fascinating dynamic where bakers had to maintain their reputation, not just with official authorities, but with every single customer. A baker who developed a reputation for producing substandard bread would find their business evaporating as word spread through the tight-knit medieval community. The social pressure was enormous, and it created a system of quality control that was remarkably effective considering the limited technology and communication methods of the time. The bread laws also revealed the deep understanding medieval society had of the connection between food and social stability. Rulers knew that hungry people were dangerous people, and that ensuring a reliable supply of affordable, quality bread was essential for maintaining peace and order. The elaborate legal framework surrounding bread production wasn't just about consumer protection. It was about preventing the kind of bread riots and food shortages that could topple governments and spark revolutions. As the evening deepens around you and you sink further into comfort, imagine the medieval housewife making her daily trip to the baker's stall, her trained eye quickly assessing the quality of the day's offerings, her experienced hands testing the weight and texture of potential purchases. She carries with her generations of knowledge about what good bread should look, feel, and taste like. And she knows that her choice will not only feed her family, but send a message to the baker about the standards she expects. The legacy of these medieval bread laws extended far beyond the Middle Ages, influencing food regulation and consumer protection systems that continued for centuries. The idea that the government had a responsibility to ensure the quality and fair pricing of essential foods became a fundamental principle that echoes in modern food safety regulations and consumer protection laws. And as we leave this world of carefully weighed loaves and vigilant inspectors, where bread was never just bread, but a symbol of trust, quality, and social responsibility, let your mind rest on the comforting thought that even in times so different from our own, people cared deeply about ensuring that everyone had access to good, honest food, and were willing to create elaborate systems to make sure that happened. Let me take you on a journey into one of the most enchanting and mysterious aspects of medieval cuisine, a world where the line between cooking and magic was so thin it was almost invisible, where the spice cabinet was considered as important as the medicine chest, and where the simple act of seasoning food was believed to have the power to influence everything from your health to your very soul. Picture yourself stepping into the private chambers of a medieval lord's castle, where the air is thick with exotic aromas that seem to whisper of distant lands and ancient secrets. In the corner of this magnificent room stands what appears to be an ornate wooden cabinet. Its dark surface, carved with intricate designs of vines, leaves, and mysterious symbols. But this isn't just any piece of furniture. This is the spice chest, and it holds treasures more valuable than gold, more carefully guarded than jewels, and more powerful than any sword or shield in the castle's armory. Each small compartment contains substances that have traveled thousands of miles, changed hands dozens of times, and cost fortunes to acquire. The medieval understanding of spices went far beyond simple flavoring. In a world where medicine, cooking, and magic were intricately intertwined, spices were believed to possess almost supernatural powers. They could cure diseases, ward off evil spirits, enhance mental abilities, inspire love, and even predict the future. The wealthy didn't just use spices to make their food taste better. They used them as tools for manipulating the very forces of nature itself. For a moment, the spice known as cinnamon, which we now sprinkle carelessly on our coffee or bake into simple desserts. In medieval times, cinnamon was believed to be a gift from paradise itself, literally gathered from the nests of phoenix birds who collected the precious bark to line their nests before burning themselves to ash and being reborn. The story went that brave merchants would have to steal this cinnamon from the phoenix nests, risking being consumed by the magical fires of these mythical creatures. Of course, we know now that cinnamon comes from the bark of certain trees in Ceylon and other tropical regions. But the medieval mind created these elaborate mythologies around spices, partly because their true origins were so mysterious, and partly because the substances themselves seemed to possess almost magical properties. When you tasted cinnamon for the first time, with its warm, sweet, slightly burning sensation that seemed to awaken every sense in your body, wouldn't you believe it came from some supernatural source? But cinnamon was just the beginning of the medieval spice cabinet's wonders. Take pepper, for instance, which was so valuable that it was literally used as currency in some regions. A pound of pepper could be worth a pound of silver, and pepper was accepted for paying taxes, dowries, and ransoms. But beyond its monetary value, pepper was believed to have remarkable medicinal and magical properties. Medieval physicians prescribed pepper for everything from digestive problems to depression, and many people believed that carrying peppercorns in your pocket could protect you from evil spirits and bad luck. The spice, known as long pepper, which is virtually unknown today, but was incredibly popular in medieval times, was thought to enhance intelligence and memory. Students would consume small amounts of long pepper before important examinations, and scholars would season their food with it, believing it would help them understand complex philosophical and theological concepts. Picture a medieval university, its halls filled with young men earnestly studying their texts, while carefully sprinkling their simple meals with this precious spice, convinced that each grain was making them smarter and more capable of unlocking the mysteries of the universe. That golden spice that even today commands astronomical prices was surrounded by perhaps the most elaborate mythology of all. Medieval people believed that saffron was literally made of crystallized sunlight, that it could cure melancholy by bringing the warmth and joy of the sun directly into the body. They used it not just for cooking, but for dyeing fine fabrics, creating illuminated manuscripts, and even painting religious artwork. A wealthy medieval household would use saffron so sparingly that each thread of the precious spice would be counted and accounted for, like individual gold coins. But here's where the story becomes truly fascinating. Medieval cooks and physicians didn't just use these spices individually. They created complex combinations that were believed to have specific magical and medicinal effects. These spice blends, known as compound spices, were closely guarded secrets passed down through generations of cooks and healers. Each blend was designed for a particular purpose, some to enhance courage before battle, others to inspire romantic feelings, and still others to promote long life and good health. One of the most famous of these compound spices was called powder deuce, a sweet spice mixture that typically included cinnamon, ginger, nutmeg, and sugar. This wasn't just a seasoning. It was considered a medicine that could balance the body's humors and promote general well-being. Wealthy families would have their own special recipes for powder deuce, jealously guarded, formulations that were considered as valuable as any family treasure. Another popular compound spice was powder fort, a much stronger and more complex blend that might include pepper, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, and sometimes even more exotic ingredients like grains of paradise or cubeb pepper. This fierce mixture was believed to have powerful warming properties that could cure everything from arthritis to impotence. The very name suggested its strength, and it was used sparingly, almost like a magical potion rather than a simple seasoning. The process of obtaining these exotic spices was itself viewed through a lens of magic and mystery. Medieval people understood vaguely that spices came from distant lands, but the actual details of their cultivation and preparation were shrouded in secrecy and myth. Merchants who dealt in spices encouraged these mysterious stories because they helped justify the enormous prices they charged. Why shouldn't pepper cost a fortune if it had to be gathered from trees guarded by serpents in the mountains of paradise? Picture the scene when a spice merchant arrived in a medieval town, his carefully protected cargo containing treasures that most people would see maybe once or twice in their entire lives. The merchant would set up his stall in the market square, carefully displaying small samples of his wares, while keeping the bulk of his precious cargo hidden and heavily guarded. People would gather around his stall not just to buy, but to experience the wonder of these exotic substances, to smell aromas that transported them instantly to imagined worlds of tropical paradises and magical kingdoms. The wealthy would send their most trusted servants to negotiate for spice purchases, armed with detailed instructions about quality, price, and authenticity. Because just as these spices were incredibly valuable, they were also frequently counterfeited. Unscrupulous merchants would mix genuine spices with cheaper substances or try to pass off local herbs as exotic imports. Wealthy households developed elaborate testing procedures to verify the authenticity of their spice purchases, examining color, texture, aroma, and even taste to ensure they weren't being cheated. The use of spices in medieval cooking was also guided by the medical theory of the four humors, which held that all foods and medicines could be classified as hot, cold, wet, or dry. Spices were generally considered to be hot and dry, which made them perfect for for balancing foods that were thought to be cold and wet, like most vegetables and fish. A skilled medieval cook didn't just season food for flavor. They carefully calculated the humoral balance of each dish, adding spices not just to make the food taste good, but to ensure it would have the proper effect on the health and temperament of those who ate it. Imagine the medieval cook in their kitchen, surrounded by the intoxicating aromas of a dozen different spices, carefully measuring out tiny portions of these precious substances, while muttering half-remembered prayers and incantations designed to enhance their magical properties. Each pinch of spice added to the pot wasn't just about creating delicious food. It was about crafting something that could nourish the body, heal the spirit, and perhaps even touch the divine. And as we leave this world of magical spices and compound wonders, where every meal was an opportunity to experience the exotic and supernatural, let your mind rest on the gentle truth that even in our modern world, there's still something almost magical about the way a pinch of cinnamon can transform a simple dish. How the aroma of good spice can transport us instantly to memories of comfort and warmth, connecting us across the centuries to those medieval cooks who understood that food seasoned with care and mystery could nourish far more than just the body. Now let me guide you into one of the most ingenious and surprising aspects of medieval food culture, a world where necessity sparked creativity, so brilliant that it produced preservation techniques that would make modern food scientists weep with admiration. Picture yourself in the golden light of late autumn, when the medieval world transformed into a bustling hive of activity as communities raced against the approaching winter to preserve the bounty of harvest season. The air carries the scent of wood smoke and the earthy richness of root vegetables. And everywhere you look, people are engaged in the ancient art of making food last through the long, cold months ahead. But this wasn't just about survival, though survival was certainly at stake. Medieval preservation was elevated to an art form so sophisticated, so creative, and so effective that many of the techniques developed during this time are still used by gourmet chefs and artisanal food producers today. The medieval mind, faced with the challenge of keeping food safe and nutritious without refrigeration, without preservatives, and without any of the technology we take for granted, responded with innovations that seem almost magical in their ingenuity. Let me tell you about one of the most remarkable preservation techniques of the medieval world, something called confying, which sounds almost like a word from a fairy tale, but was actually a precise and scientific method of food preservation that produced results so delicious they were sought after by royalty and nobles throughout Europe. Picture a medieval kitchen in the heart of autumn, where skilled cooks would take the finest cuts of duck, goose, or pork and begin a transformation process that would preserve these precious proteins for months while actually improving their flavor and texture. The process began with the careful selection of the meat, which had to be perfectly fresh and of the highest quality. The chosen pieces would then be seasoned with a precise blend of salt and spices, not just for flavor, but because certain spices contained natural preservative properties that the medieval cooks understood intuitively, even without knowing the scientific principles behind them. The seasoned meat would then be cooked very slowly in its own fat, at temperatures so carefully controlled that modern chefs still marvel at the precision medieval cooks achieved using nothing but wood fires and their own experience. As the meat cooked gently in the rendered fat, something almost alchemical happened. The fat penetrated every fiber of the meat while simultaneously creating an impermeable seal around it. When the cooking was complete, the meat would be placed in special containers and completely covered with the same fat it had been cooked in, creating an anaerobic environment that prevented spoilage while maintaining incredible flavor and nutritional value. Meat preserved this way could last for 6 months or more, growing more tender and flavorful with age. But the genius of confying went beyond simple preservation. Medieval cooks discovered that different types of fat produced different flavors and preservation qualities. Duck fat created a rich, savory preservation medium, perfect for other poultry or delicate vegetables. Pork fat or lard was ideal for preserving beef and game meats. Goose fat was prized for its ability to preserve while adding a subtle, complex flavor that enhanced rather than masked the natural taste of the preserved food. The containers used for confit were works of art in themselves, specially designed ceramic crocks with tight-fitting lids that created perfect seals. These containers were often decorated with beautiful glazes and patterns, because even utilitarian objects in the medieval world were expected to be pleasing to the eye. Wealthy households would have dozens of these preservation vessels, each one labeled with its contents and the date of preservation, creating what amounted to a gourmet pantry that could sustain the household through even the harshest winter. But meat wasn't the only food that medieval cooks preserved with this remarkable technique. Vegetables, particularly root vegetables like turnips, carrots, and onions, were often confited in various fats to create preserved side dishes that retained their nutritional value while developing complex, rich flavors. Even fruits were sometimes preserved this way, cooked slowly in rendered fat, nuts or other plant sources to create sweet preserves that could last for months. Another preservation technique that reveals the sophisticated understanding medieval cooks had of food science was the use of what they called salt boxes. These weren't simple containers for storing salt, but rather elaborate preservation systems that used salt's natural dehydrating and antimicrobial properties to preserve everything from fish to vegetables to cheese. Picture a medieval storehouse where rows of wooden boxes, each one carefully packed with layers of coarse salt and preserved foods, line the walls like a library of edible treasures. The salt box technique required incredible precision and knowledge. Different foods required different types of salt, different layering patterns, and different packing densities. Fish, for example, would be layered with coarse sea salt in a specific pattern that allowed the salt to draw out moisture while preventing the fish from becoming too dry or too salty. Vegetables were packed with rock salt and aromatic herbs that not only preserved them but infused them with complex flavors that improved over time. Medieval cooks also developed a fascinating preservation technique using honey, which they understood had natural antimicrobial properties, even though they couldn't explain why in scientific terms. Honey preservation, or honeying, as it was sometimes called, involved completely submerging foods in pure honey, creating an environment where harmful bacteria couldn't survive. Fruits preserved this way would maintain their shape, color, and much of their nutritional value for months. emerging from their honey bath looking as fresh as the day they were preserved. The most elaborate honey preservation involved creating what were essentially edible time capsules. Whole roasted birds, for example, might be completely encased in honey and stored in specially designed containers. When opened months later, these preserved delicacies would emerge perfectly preserved, the honey having penetrated the meat and created flavors of incredible complexity and richness. But perhaps the most surprising medieval preservation technique involved the use of alcohol, not just as a beverage, but as a sophisticated preservation medium. Medieval cooks discovered that certain fruits and vegetables could be preserved in strong alcohol, creating what we might think of as the ancestors of modern liqueurs and flavored spirits. These alcohol preserves served a dual purpose, preserving precious foods while creating beverages that could provide both nutrition and pleasure during the long winter months. The process of alcohol preservation was elevated to an art form in medieval monasteries, where monks had both the time and the resources to experiment with different combinations of fruits, vegetables, herbs, and spirits. They developed complex recipes that were closely guarded secrets, passed down through generations of monastery cooks and considered as valuable as any religious manuscript. Picture a medieval monastery cellar, its cool stone walls lined with hundreds of containers, each one containing foods preserved, slowly developing flavors of incredible complexity. The monks would carefully monitor these preserves, tasting and adjusting them over months or even years, creating what amounted to an edible library of preserved foods that could sustain the monastery through any crisis. The social implications of these preservation techniques were enormous. Families that mastered the art of food preservation had a significant advantage in terms of survival and prosperity. They could weather bad harvests, support larger households, and even engage in trade by selling their preserved foods to less fortunate neighbors. Knowledge of preservation techniques was passed down through families like precious heirlooms, with mothers teaching daughters not just recipes but the subtle skills needed to judge temperatures, timing, and quality that made the difference between success and spoiled food. As you settle deeper into the peaceful rhythm of this medieval world, imagine the satisfaction and security that came from a well-stocked preservation pantry. Picture the medieval housewife surveying her rows of preserved foods, knowing that her family would eat well, regardless of what winter might bring. Each jar, each crock, each carefully packed salt box represented not just food, but peace of mind. The knowledge that careful planning and skilled preservation could triumph over the uncertainties of medieval life. And as we leave this world of ingenious preservation, where necessity mothered inventions that still amaze us today, let your mind rest on the comforting knowledge that human creativity and ingenuity have always found ways to transform challenges into opportunities, to turn the simple need to preserve food into an art form that nourished both body and soul. Let me draw you into the most spectacular and theatrical aspect of medieval food culture, a world where dining became performance art, where meals were elaborate productions that could rival any stage play in their complexity and drama. Picture yourself approaching a great castle on the night of an important feast, the windows glowing warmly against the dark sky, the sound of music and laughter drifting across the courtyard, and the tantalizing aromas of extraordinary dishes wafting through the evening air. You're about to witness something that would leave even our most extravagant modern celebrations looking modest by comparison. As you enter the great hall, you're immediately struck by the transformation that has taken place. This isn't just a room prepared for dinner. It's a stage set for an elaborate theatrical production, where food itself is both the star performer and the supporting cast. The long tables are draped with fine linens that seem to glow in the flickering light of hundreds of candles. The walls are hung with tapestries depicting scenes of hunting, feasting, and mythical adventures, as if the very walls are telling stories that will be echoed in the evening's entertainment. But it's when the first course arrives that you realize you've entered a world where the normal rules of dining have been completely transformed. The servants don't simply bring out plates of food. They present what can only be described as edible sculptures, culinary masterpieces that blur the line between cooking and art. Picture a massive platter being carried into the hall, and on it, a life-sized swan made entirely of food. Its graceful neck arched proudly, its wings spread as if it's about to take flight, its eyes made of precious gems that glitter in the candlelight dot. This incredible creation isn't just for show, though its appearance is certainly magnificent. The swan is actually a complex construction of roasted meats, carefully arranged and sculpted to create the illusion of a living bird. The body might be made from a roasted peacock or goose, the neck from carefully arranged slices of venison, and the wings from intricately folded pastry that has been gilded with real gold leaf to catch and reflect the light. When carved and served, this edible sculpture provides genuine nourishment, but its primary purpose is to astonish and delight the guests, to create a moment of wonder that will be talked about for years to come. But the swan is just the beginning of the evening's culinary theater. As course follows course, each presentation becomes more elaborate and surprising than the last. Picture servants carrying in what appears to be a miniature castle, complete with towers, walls, and flags, all constructed entirely from various foods. The walls might be made from molded cheese, the towers from carefully carved and stacked breads, and the flags from thin sheets of pastry painted with edible dyes to create heraldic designs. This isn't just decoration, it's an edible representation of the host's own castle, a way of literally allowing guests to consume his power and prestige. The level of planning and skill required to create these culinary spectacles was extraordinary. Teams of specialized cooks, artists, and even architects would work for weeks preparing for a single feast, designing and constructing edible masterpieces that combined advanced cooking techniques with artistic vision and engineering precision. The head cook of a great household wasn't just a culinary professional. They were the director of an elaborate theatrical production, coordinating the efforts of dozens of specialists to create an evening of edible entertainment. One of the most remarkable aspects of these medieval food spectacles was the way they incorporated live entertainment directly into the dining experience. Picture the moment when servants wheel in what appears to be a massive pie, decorated with elaborate pastry work and standing several feet tall. The guests watch with anticipation as the pie is ceremoniously cut open. But instead of revealing a traditional filling, live birds come flying out, released from hidden compartments within the pastry structure. This is the famous 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie that we know from nursery rhymes. But in medieval times, it was a real spectacle that never failed to delight and amaze guests. These surprise presentations could become incredibly elaborate. Some pies contained not just birds, but entire menageries of small animals, or even human performers who would emerge to sing songs or recite poetry. The pie itself was usually just a container, with the actual food being served separately. But the moment of surprise and delight when the pie was opened was considered as important as any course of the meal. The medieval feast also featured what were known as subtleties, elaborate food sculptures that were designed to tell stories or convey messages to the guests. These weren't just random decorative pieces. They were carefully planned elements that connected to the occasion being celebrated, the status of the guests, or the political messages the host wanted to convey. Picture a subtlety depicting a famous battle, with armies of knights made from sugar and marzipan arranged in battle formation, or a religious scene crafted entirely from various foods and designed to inspire contemplation and devotion. The creation of these subtleties required artists who were skilled not just in cooking but in sculpture, painting, and storytelling. They had to understand how different foods would behave when molded and shaped, how to create colors using natural dyes and ingredients, and how to construct complex scenes that would remain stable throughout the evening but could be disassembled and eaten when the time came. The progression of courses at a medieval feast followed a carefully orchestrated rhythm designed to build excitement and anticipation throughout the evening. Each course would be announced with fanfare, sometimes literally with trumpets and drums, and presented with increasing levels of spectacle and surprise. The early courses might feature impressive but relatively straightforward dishes, but as the evening progressed, the presentations would become more elaborate, more surprising, and more theatrical between courses. There might be entertainment that was itself food-related. Professional carvers would demonstrate their skills by performing elaborate carving ceremonies, turning the simple act of slicing meat into a graceful dance performed with specialized knives and tools. These carvers were highly skilled professionals who could disassemble a roasted bird or joint of meat with movements so precise and graceful that the process became a form of performance art. The beverages served at these feasts were just as theatrical as the food. Wine might be served from elaborate fountains that created continuous streams of different colored wines, or from mechanical devices that dispensed drinks when guests performed specific actions. Some households featured automated wine servers, mechanical figures that would pour drinks when activated, creating an element of magic and wonder that enhanced the overall theatrical experience. The seating arrangements at these feasts were themselves part of the performance, with guests arranged not just according to social rank, but according to their role in the evening's entertainment. Important guests might be seated where they could best appreciate the visual spectacles being presented, while others might be positioned to participate in interactive elements of the meal. The medieval feast was also a showcase for the host's wealth and power, but in ways that went far beyond simple display of expensive ingredients. the ability to command the services of skilled artists, entertainers, and craftspeople, to coordinate elaborate presentations that required precise timing and execution, and to create experiences that guests would remember and talk about for years. All of this demonstrated a level of resources and organizational capability that was itself a form of political messaging. As the evening progressed and course followed a spectacular course, guests would find themselves not just fed, but thoroughly entertained, educated, and impressed. They had witnessed demonstrations of their host's wealth, power, creativity, and sophistication. They had participated in a cultural experience that combined fine dining, visual art, live entertainment, and social interaction in ways that created memories and relationships that could last a lifetime. The influence of these elaborate medieval feasting traditions extended far beyond the dining hall. They helped establish traditions of hospitality, entertainment, and social interaction that influenced European culture for centuries. The idea that important occasions should be marked with elaborate meals, that food presentation should be beautiful as well as delicious, and that dining could be a form of entertainment and art. All of these concepts trace their roots back to the extravagant theatrical feasts of the medieval period. As you drift away from this magnificent hall, with its glittering subtleties and elaborate presentations, carrying with you the memory of swan sculptures, let your mind rest on the knowledge that even in times very different from our own, people understood the power of shared meals to create joy, wonder, and connection. The medieval feast reminds us that food can be far more than simple nourishment, that it can be art, entertainment, and magic all at once, bringing people together in experiences that nourish not just the body, but the imagination and the spirit. And so we come to the end of our gentle journey through the surprising world of medieval food, where trenchers served as both plate and charity, where sugar was more precious than gold, where bread was regulated like a controlled substance, where spices were believed to possess magical powers, where preservation techniques rivaled modern food science, and where feasts became elaborate theatrical productions that dazzled all who witnessed them. May these memories of medieval kitchens and dining halls guide you into peaceful dreams, dreams filled with the warm glow of hearth fires, the comfort of simple abundance transformed into wonder, and the gentle wisdom of people who understood that food, prepared and shared with care, could nourish far more than just the body. If you found yourself drifting peacefully through these tales of culinary history, if these stories helped carry you toward restful sleep, let me know in the comments below. Until we meet again for another journey through history's gentle mysteries. Sweet dreams, dear friends, and may your own meals, however simple, carry a touch of that medieval magic that transformed necessity into wonder and hunger into joy.